Before you hear the story, listen to the silence. Not the silence of sound, the silence of credit. For years, millions of Americans have been listening to a voice that feels calm, intelligent, and reliable. A voice that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, doesn't beg for attention. It simply explains. That voice didn't come from nowhere. It was shaped in classrooms where respect mattered more than ego. In homes where children were taught to speak clearly, slowly, and with humility. In a culture where being understood was more important than being loud. This is Filipino culture at work. Not performance. Not dominance. Precision. And long before social media noticed it, that voice slipped into American media, quietly, professionally, without asking to be seen. The strange part? No one pushed it out. It was invited in. Here's what most people don't realize. American media didn't choose Filipino English because it was cheap. They chose it because it worked. Filipino speakers didn't just learn English, they learned how to listen first. In Filipino culture, you don't interrupt authority. You don't overpower the room. You earn trust by being steady. That shows up in the voice. And in an era where audiences were tired of shouting, tired of bias, tired of aggressive opinions, this voice felt different. Balanced. Thoughtful. Human. So it spread. From news explainers, to narration, to AI voices, to entire channels built on calm authority. Not because Filipinos demanded the spotlight, but because their culture trained them to hold it. And this is where the story starts to turn. Because once a voice becomes trusted, it becomes powerful. And when a culture shapes the voice of information, it shapes how truth itself is received. We haven't even reached the moment when America realized what was happening. That comes later. Before this voice ever reached American screens, it was shaped in a very different place. In the Philippines, English is not spoken casually. It's spoken with awareness. Children grow up switching between languages without realizing they're doing something rare. At home, Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, warmth, emotion, rhythm. At school, English, structure, precision, control. But more important than grammar was tone. Filipino students were taught not just how to speak, but how they sounded while speaking. Teachers corrected posture. They corrected pacing. They corrected attitude. Not because they wanted perfection, but because in Filipino culture, how you deliver words shows respect for the listener. You don't rush people. You don't overpower them. You don't speak as if you're above them. You speak so you can be understood. That mindset stays with you. It follows Filipinos into adulthood, into work, into microphones they never imagined they'd be holding. And that's the part most people miss. This voice wasn't trained for America. It was trained for respect. At first, American media didn't notice anything special. They just knew something felt easier. Explainers with certain narrations kept people watching longer. News breakdowns felt calmer, less aggressive. Serious topics felt digestible. No one wrote a memo. No executive made a speech. But decisions kept repeating. This voice works. This one feels professional. This one doesn't scare the audience away. And slowly, Filipino voices began filling spaces Americans were abandoning. Late-night narration, back-end journalism, online news channels, corporate explainers. Not because Filipinos demanded those roles, but because they fit them perfectly. The irony. The more invisible the voice felt, the more powerful it became. Audiences weren't distracted by personality. They weren't triggered by tone. They just listened. And listening is where influence begins. By the time anyone thought to question it, it was already too late. The voice had become normal. Normal enough that Americans stopped noticing it. Normal enough that creators copied it unconsciously. Normal enough that AI models began training on it. And when machines start learning your voice, your culture has already left fingerprints on the future. But here's the most uncomfortable part. This happened without praise, without headlines, without acknowledgement. Filipino culture didn't announce itself. It didn't demand recognition. It simply stayed consistent. And consistency, over time, beats noise. We are still only at the beginning of this story. Because once a voice becomes trusted, it doesn't just explain information. It decides how truth feels. And that's where everything changes. By now, something had already changed, even if no one said it out loud. American audiences weren't just listening anymore. They were depending on the voice. When a story was complicated, they waited for it to be explained that way. When a topic felt heavy, they wanted that calm delivery to soften it. When the world felt chaotic, this voice made things feel manageable. And that's how trust quietly crossed a line. Because trust, repeated daily, becomes habit. And habit becomes expectation. Viewers didn't say, "I want a Filipino voice." They said, "I want this to make sense." And somehow, it always did. What no one realized yet was that this wasn't accidental alignment. It was cultural muscle memory playing out on a global stage. Filipino culture teaches you to adjust yourself to the room, not the other way around. To read the listener. To slow down when confusion appears. To remain composed even when pressure rises. So when American media needed stability, it didn't find it in louder voices. It found it here. And once a system starts leaning on something that works, it leans harder the next time. Humans weren't the first to notice the pattern. The algorithm was. Watch time increased. Completion rates climbed. Comments stayed calmer. No outrage spikes. No emotional whiplash. Just steady engagement. And the algorithm doesn't care about culture. It only cares about behavior. So it began rewarding the tone. Promoting it. Replicating it. Spreading it. Creators who had never spoken to a Filipino in their lives started adjusting their delivery, unknowingly mimicking cadence, pacing, and restraint. Some slowed down their speech. Some softened their tone. Some stripped emotion out of their voice to sound more professional. They thought they were becoming neutral. They were actually becoming closer to Filipino English. And here's the hook most people miss. Once platforms reward a style, they lock it in. What works today becomes tomorrow's standard. And tomorrow's standard becomes invisible power. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a very specific moment in American media. People were exhausted. Tired of shouting. Tired of bias. Tired of being told how to feel. They didn't want passion anymore. They wanted clarity. And Filipino culture has always leaned toward clarity over confrontation. In Filipino homes, conversations aren't won by volume. They're guided by patience. In Filipino workplaces, respect is shown by control, not dominance. That cultural instinct translated perfectly to a media environment desperate for balance. So while others competed to be the loudest voice in the room, Filipino English quietly became the voice people stayed with the longest. Not because it demanded attention, because it never wasted it. Behind every voice that America trusted, there was someone who trained it, perfected it, and carried a culture through every syllable. Meet Daniel Reyes. Early 20s, Filipino, quiet confidence etched into his eyes. Not flashy, not loud. But everything about him commanded attention in subtle ways. Daniel didn't just speak English. He understood it as a bridge between cultures. He learned to modulate his tone, pace, and pauses to be heard clearly without forcing respect. At first, Daniel was just another name in a roster. But as American media began absorbing voices like his, the system slowly started relying on him, unknowingly. He didn't ask for it. He didn't boast. He simply delivered. Every explanation he gave, every narration he recorded, was informed by centuries of Filipino cultural discipline, patience, clarity, and respect. A single word out of place could ruin the effect, but Daniel never made mistakes. And here's where it gets interesting. The people who heard him first didn't realize why his delivery felt different. It wasn't the accent. It wasn't the vocabulary. It was the rhythm of trust itself. As he recorded, he watched subtle patterns unfold. Algorithms rewarded his pacing, audience engagement spiked without obvious reason, and his calm, measured tone became a blueprint. Daniel Reyes, unknowingly, was teaching millions of Americans how to listen, and they didn't know it. The question now, how far would this influence go before anyone realized what had happened? And more importantly, could anyone ever challenge it? The answer isn't coming yet. Daniel Reyes didn't just narrate. He observed. Every word he spoke, every pause he took, was carefully calibrated without him even realizing it. As he recorded more videos, patterns began to emerge. Certain phrasings held attention longer. Certain tones made audiences lean in without knowing why. Algorithms rewarded subtlety over drama. And viewers, unknowingly, trusted him more than anyone else. At first, it was barely noticeable. A rise in watch time here. A calmer comments section there. Nothing obvious, yet enough to hint at quiet power forming behind the scenes. Daniel began to realize something instinctive. Filipino culture had trained him his whole life for moments like this. Discipline to remain calm under pressure, humility to let work speak louder than words. Patience to adjust and read the audience without confrontation. Each recording became a small experiment. Proof that culture can quietly shape influence. The results were subtle but exponential. Creators across platforms started copying his cadence, often unknowingly. Neutral voice began to mean Filipino English, even if no one recognized it. Daniel's calm, measured delivery was reshaping how millions of people in America perceived authority. And here's the tension. No one noticed him yet. No one knew his name. Yet, this quiet Filipino voice was leaving ripples far beyond its origin. Daniel kept moving, unassuming, almost invisible. But every recording carried influence. By the end of this chapter, audiences begin to sense it. This wasn't just about clarity or language. It was about control, trust, and cultural power quietly guiding perception. And Daniel never raised his voice. Sometimes, the quietest voice is the one that leaves the largest mark. Daniel Reyes wasn't just shaping voices, he was shaping perception. Each recording, each calm explanation, was a lesson in subtle influence. Viewers didn't realize it yet, but their understanding of authority, credibility, and trust was being quietly molded by him. And the strange thing? No one noticed how deliberate it was. Not the viewers. Not the creators copying him. Not even the platforms that promoted his voice over thousands of others. Because influence like this is invisible. It slips through unnoticed. It feels normal. It feels safe. But the pattern was undeniable, calm, measured, consistent. The exact traits Daniel had absorbed from Filipino culture were now shaping how millions perceived news and information across America. Daniel began to see the signs himself. Metrics climbing. Engagement increasing. Comments more trusting. Algorithms promoting content like his automatically. And a question started to form in his mind. How far could this reach? How much of what people believed, felt, or trusted was quietly being guided by him, by Filipino culture, by the lessons he had grown up with? Yet Daniel remained composed. Because that's what Filipino culture had taught him. Never overstate your role. Let your actions, your discipline, your work, speak for you. Influence quietly, and it lasts far longer than noise ever could. By the end of the section, viewers should feel the tension rising. Something big is happening, something unseen, and the world doesn't know it yet. Daniel isn't just a narrator anymore. He's a cultural force, and the ripple effects are only beginning. Daniel Reyes began to notice something extraordinary. It wasn't just the metrics. It wasn't just algorithms favoring his delivery. It was the reaction of people. Viewers who had never thought about Filipino culture or discipline were subconsciously absorbing it. Trust, calm, reliability, authority, all shaped by one quiet voice, one that carried the weight of generations of Filipino culture, patience, and respect. The tipping point came when his narrations began influencing other narrators. Creators started mimicking his cadence, pauses, and tone, unknowingly replicating the Filipino cultural rhythm. Even AI voice models began learning from recordings like his. And yet, Daniel didn't seek recognition. He didn't announce victories. He simply continued, step by step, video by video. The tension in the room, and in the story, grew. Everyone could feel it, even if they didn't know why. A quiet revolution was unfolding, carried by discipline, respect, and clarity.